Welcome back to another episode of Offbeat Adventures. We're standing here once again on the grade of the former Canadian Northern Railway and later Canadian National Railway's Kinghorn Subdivision. We are just to the east of the community of Geraldton, here in the municipality of Greenstone. So we're here on the grade. We're picking up right where we left off on a previous hike that we did last spring, about a couple of weeks from now, so towards the end of May. Today is the 13th of May. It is actually our first hike of the year. We've had once again a particularly bad spring, and so this is our first time getting out, and we had to wait to the second week of May to do it. As you're going to see, the snow has just gone away here, or partially gone away here in the last week. You can see there's still piles of snow inside the bush and alongside the grade. You can see there's quite a bit of water alongside the grade in places. So we're right at the beginning of the siding here at Geraldton, or one of the sidings here at Geraldton. This was the main one that was used in more sort of recent history. Where we are right here is, let me find it, there it is back there. We are at milepost 20. So the mileage on the Kinghorn is measured from a place called Longlac, which is just to the east of us here, or the lighter mileage. And the mileage on the original line, which I'm going to be talking about very, very shortly, is 120.8. So basically our hike is going to take us from here right at the beginning of this siding, and we are going to be working our way through the community. The railway kind of cuts through the northern part of the community, and it's going to take us to the western side of Geraldton to a place called Hard Rock Creek. Now we do have another little stopping point, so we're actually kind of repeating a couple of things that we did when we hiked this last year. We just kind of backtracked a little bit. You can see it is a beautiful, beautiful spring day. The weather this week has been gorgeous. Again, quite literally, we went from no spring to spring. Again, we had a pretty miserable April. We got more snowfall in April than we got in January, February, and March combined. And it was cold, and the snow didn't want to go away, and I can't find this flanger sign that's here. Oh, I walked by it. It's way over here. There it is. I walked by it again. So here's the flanger sign for the siding. You can see last year it was kind of high and dry sitting off to the side here. I had to pull it out of the water with its obligatory bullet holes in it. You can see all kinds of remnants here beside the grade. So as I was saying, it is a beautiful day. It's supposed to get up to about 15 degrees. This week's been very warm, like temperatures in the high teens and low 20s. Okay, so you can see our complimentary snow here. You can see there's still a bit of it beside the grade. All right, so while we have a moment here, because we're gonna have to do some stuff here right off the bat, we're gonna do our usual history lesson. So this line was constructed by Canadian Northern Railway between 1911 and 1914. It was going to be one of the final pieces in Canadian Northern's transcontinental ambitions. The Canadian Northern Company got its start in Manitoba way back in 1896. And then their first major project was building a line from the then city of Port Arthur, which is now Thunder Bay, to Winnipeg, and that line opened in 1902. Subsequent to that, they began building lines throughout the prairies, and Canadian Northern sort of became synonymous with many of their lines and branch lines throughout the prairies, particularly the northern part of the prairies. And then the Canadian Northern Company began expanding into Eastern Canada, and so they began eventually building north and acquiring lines out of Toronto, eventually reaching up into the Sudbury area. It was around about that time that Canadian Northern started to realize that for their company to be viable long term, that they would need a transcontinental connection. Now the problem is that they weren't particularly keen on building some of the sections to make a transcontinental line, particularly this section, so the section between the Sudbury area, specifically Ruel, and Port Arthur, because it was going to be very difficult to build with the geography in this area, and therefore it was going to be very expensive. So they looked at all kinds of different options, up to including doing a running rights agreement with Canadian Pacific Railway. Unfortunately, none of those options or ideas panned out, and eventually the Canadian Northern Company was forced to build. And so again, construction began in the latter half of 1911 and carried through until 1914. So New Year's Day 1914, the last spike was driven, and the line opened for traffic in 1915. Now, unfortunately, just as the line was opening, the company started running into some pretty big financial difficulties, basically twofold. Some brought on by World War I, and secondly, a lot of building overruns and building costs associated with finishing the transcontinental line. So building through the mountains of British Columbia, building this section through the Canadian Shield. And so the company started to have a lot of financial difficulties. I just want to pause here for a second. So basically, this is mileage-wise right where the sort of second station in this area was built, so what we would call Geraldton East, and I'll sort of explain that as we get a little bit sort of further on. So by 1917, Canadian Northern was in some very, very difficult financial impingements, and basically had to been taken over by the Canadian government. And a year later, at the end of 1918, the line was merged by the Canadian government, or amalgamated, however you want to describe it, with a bunch of other Canadian government-owned bankrupt lines known as the Canadian Government Railways. And that merger produced Canadian National Railways, which began operation in January of 1919. So originally, the name of this line had been the Long Lake Subdivision of Canadian Northern Railway, and eventually that was changed to the Long Lac Subdivision of Canadian National Railways. And about the time that the whole nationalization process was completed in 1923, there was big changes afoot for this line. And so essentially what ended up happening was Canadian National decided to build a cutoff from the community of Long Lac, which again is 20 miles to our east, and basically running that line up to the community of Nakina, where it intersected with the National Transcontinental Railway, and that piece of line became known as the Nakina Cutoff. And when that happened, when that line opened in 1924, it relegated this line to secondary status. And so this line running from Long Lac all the way to Port Arthur was no longer on the main line anymore. And obviously that had some pretty serious repercussions. And so in 1924, when the cutoff opened, the name of this line changed once again. It became the Kinghorn Subdivision. Again, it was part of sort of a big reorganization that was happening. And so the line remained as the Kinghorn till 1960, when there was yet another reorganization. And so the Kinghorn Subdivision, which ran to Jellicoe, which is just to the west of us, was merged with the Dorian Subdivision, which ran from Jellicoe to Port Arthur, and the whole line became the Kinghorn Subdivision. And the line continued to operate from 1960 all the way till 2005, and that's when Canadian National decided to discontinue service on the line. And beginning in 2008, they began ripping up the rails, and that process was complete by 2010. So perfect timing here. You can still see the siding here beside us. So what we have here is, first of all, you can see there's some remnants of telegraph insulators here and telegraph poles. You can see pegs, you can see Dominion 42 insulators. I'm not sure exactly where this came from. You can see there's another one here. A lot of them are broken. It could have come from the telegraph pole. There's more pieces over there. It could have come from the telegraph pole that's right down there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to jump down and go take a look at that. Okay, so we made our way down here to take a look at this telegraph pole. Because it is early spring, it is very wet here, and this is about as close as I can get, I guess. So you can see the pole here. It's in really, really rough shape. A lot of the insulators on here are broken. Pretty much all Dominion 42s. There is a Dominion 16 on the side peg here, which is kind of a bit of an unusual find. Okay, so let's jump back up on the grade here and continue our journey.